Newspapers said 1 million Americans fled their homes in terror. Almost none of them did. In this explainer, we're separating the real story of the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast from the absolute myth of nationwide panic that newspapers completely manufactured around it. To understand how we were all so thoroughly fooled, we really have to pull back the curtain and look at what actually happened that night.
It started as a Halloween night radio play, nothing more. Picture this, it's October 30th, 1938. You've got a 23-year-old theatrical wonderkind named Orson Welles stepping up to a CBS microphone. He and his Mercury Theater Company were gearing up to perform a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells's classic science fiction novel, The War of the Worlds. Now, to keep the audience hooked, Wells and his writer, Howard Koch, decided to give this dusty Victorian tale a massive modern facelift.
And honestly, this is where the creative genius really shines. They formatted the entire play to sound exactly like a string of fake breaking news bulletins. So instead of some booming announcer just reading a story, listeners heard what sounded like ordinary programming. A boring weather forecast, a hotel orchestra playing dance music. And then, bam, it's suddenly interrupted by these urgent, real-time news flashes describing a terrifying Martian invasion touching down on a farm in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. The pacing was incredibly frantic, the sound effects were masterful, and the illusion they created was, well, deeply unsettling. A small number of listeners tuning in mid-broadcast missed the one detail that mattered. Right at 8 p.m., a very clear opening disclaimer announced that the play was totally fictional. But here's the catch. Network radio on Sunday nights was basically owned by ventriloquist Edgar Bergen over on NBC. Everyone was listening to him. When Bergen's show went to a musical interlude right around 8:12 p.m., bored dial surfers spun their radio knobs and just happened to land on CBS. Fast forward to 8:40 p.m., and these fictional Martian attacks had escalated into full-blown gas raids and heat rays literally destroying Manhattan. Missing that opening disclaimer meant mistaking fiction for actual terrifying news. And we've got to put ourselves in the mindset of 1938 here. The Munich crisis had just kept Americans completely glued to their radios for days, listening to these incredibly tense, breaking news flashes about the impending threat of war over in Europe. The audience had essentially been conditioned to trust these sudden radio interruptions. So when listeners tuned in and heard an actor playing a breathless, terrified reporter describing alien war machines, a few of them genuinely believed the nation was under attack. Now, this misunderstanding definitely led to some scattered confusion. A small number of concerned folks did exactly what you might expect. They picked up the telephone, they called local police stations, they rang up newspaper offices, they were asking authorities for advice on protective measures, really just trying to verify the horrifying stuff they were hearing on the air. Some even called in to volunteer their medical services. So there was unease, sure, and for sure there was confusion. But mass stampedes in the streets? Not even close.
The next morning, Orson Welles wasn't just a director. He was the most talked about man in America. He literally woke up to find that his relatively low-budget, completely unsponsored radio play had supposedly thrown the entire country into absolute chaos. Facing this insane barrage of newsreel cameras and screaming reporters, an exhausted Welles just expressed shock and bewilderment. He kept insisting over and over that they had only intended to perform a playful Halloween prank.
But wow, the print media told a vastly different story. Newspapers from coast to coast ran these massive front-page headlines claiming mass hysteria had swept the entire nation overnight. I mean, the New York Times literally blared, "Radio listeners in panic, taking war drama as fact." Editorials raged, and the sensational story just dominated the news cycle, cementing this wild image of an American populace terrified totally out of its wits. These sensational newspaper claims painted incredibly apocalyptic scenes. Print journalists were writing about panicked crowds stampeding through theaters. They described jammed telephone switchboards, people wrapping their heads in wet towels to survive Martian black smoke, and thousands of folks just fleeing into the streets with whatever belongings they could grab. They even went so far as to blame the broadcast for fatal heart attacks and suicides. It was a terrifying picture. Here's what the ratings company actually measured that night. When we look past all that sensational ink and actually examine the hard data, a much, much quieter picture emerges. The C.E. Hooper rating service, which was conducting a national telephone survey during the broadcast itself, found that only about 2% of the country's listeners were tuned in to Orson Welles. Let that sink in for a second. 2%. That means 98% of the country was either listening to something else entirely or just had their radios turned completely off. This simple, undeniable mathematical reality
is that you just cannot have a nationwide, million-strong panic if almost no one is actually listening to the broadcast in the first place.
On top of that, CBS's own internal research put together by network executive Frank Stanton concluded that most Americans never even heard the show. And of the incredibly small fraction who actually did listen, the vast majority recognized it immediately as a dramatic presentation. They viewed it as exactly what it was, an entertaining Halloween prank. They accepted the fiction, went along for the ride, and just enjoyed a good thriller. Not one confirmed case matched the panic the papers described. When sociologists and media historians later went back and tried to track down the specific anecdotes published in those frightening newspaper reports, the stories just evaporated. The dramatic claims of mass flight, widespread hospitalizations for shock, and nationwide hysteria, they were overwhelmingly based on unverified rumors and incredibly sketchy wire service summaries. The hard evidence simply wasn't there. Researchers who surveyed New York City hospitals found absolutely zero records of any cases brought in specifically because of the broadcast. There were zero verified suicides. At one point, the Washington Post boldly claimed a man in Baltimore died of a heart attack during the show, but no one could ever actually corroborate the story, let alone even identify the supposed victim. There were zero confirmed deaths. Literally none.
So why did an entire industry insist otherwise? Why would print media across the United States actively coordinate to manufacture a narrative of mass hysteria that completely lacked any factual foundation? What was the catch?
Well, media historians point to a massive underlying financial motive. You see, back in 1938, the country was still clawing its way out of the Great Depression, and print newspapers were the old established guard. But radio was this emerging, highly dynamic new medium, and it was rapidly siphoning absolutely vital advertising revenue right out of the newspapers' pockets. Print publishers were hemorrhaging money and influence to these new broadcast networks, and they were desperately looking for absolutely any weapon to strike back.
The scattered confusion over Orson Welles' drama handed newspapers the perfect ammunition. The print agenda here was crystal clear: sensationalize the panic to completely discredit radio as a reliable news source. By painting the broadcast as the direct cause of mass hysteria, newspapers could prove to advertisers and, more importantly, to government regulators at the FCC that radio management was wildly irresponsible. They portrayed radio as a reckless, unregulated threat to public safety that desperately needed control. A newspaper industry protecting its own revenue built a myth so convincing it's still taught as history. And this myth was actually bolstered later on by flawed academic studies like Hadley Cantrell's 1940 book, which leaned heavily on incredibly misleading data to falsely claim 1 million Americans were frightened. Over the decades, this orchestrated anti-radio propaganda just quietly morphed into an accepted historical fact, getting blindly repeated in documentaries, classrooms, and textbooks. A false story, repeated with enough authority, can shape public belief as powerfully as any real event. If you've been following our Explainer series, you'll recognize this is the exact same underlying lesson we explored with the Kitty Genovese myth. When the media establishes a powerful narrative, whether it's about urban apathy or radio-induced mass panic, that narrative can effectively overwrite the truth for generations. Orson Welles might have broadcast a fake alien invasion, but it was the newspapers that orchestrated the real hoax. Thank you for watching Dark Chronicles. Real stories, verified sources. Follow for more.